Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is July 6, 2017, and my guest is Sally Satel. She is a psychiatrist, author of numerous books, a lecturer in psychiatry at Yale University School of Medicine, and a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. She recently wrote an article with Alan Viard entitled "The Kindest Tax Cut, a Federal Tax Credit for Organ Donations," and that's going to be our topic for today. Sally, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks for having me.
So you bring a special perspective to kidney donations. Talk about your personal story.
Yeah, I got a kidney in 2006, and then I got another kidney almost a year ago today. And when I got my first one, it was sort of a surprise. A lot of people who know that they're going to need a kidney, by definition, they know they're going to need a kidney. What I meant is that they have certain illnesses. They're either diabetic or they've got lupus, severe hypertension that's been poorly managed for a while, high blood pressure. I mean, people know they're at risk for this, for kidney failure. But in my case, it was sort of a surprise. I just went to the doctor for a regular checkup. And this is the part of the story that scares everyone, because I felt completely fine. And during a routine blood draw, found out that I had kidney failure, which is rather easy to diagnose. It's a test called a creatinine level, but when you go for a regular blood draw, a routine blood draw, that's one of the indices they measure. So they tested it again, and it was the same. So the clock was ticking for me, because I knew, from my medical training, that if you have kidney failure, you need a new kidney, or you will languish on dialysis for years. And no matter how long you are on dialysis, your life will be prematurely shortened. I mean, people have lived for 20 years, even a little longer on dialysis. Some people tolerate it better than others. That's a process where your blood is cleansed of toxins about 3 times a week for about 4 hours at a time. You go to a clinic. Most people feel very debilitated by it. The average person on dialysis can't hold a job, but some do. And I say some people, it isn't as psychologically devastating to some folks, but others find it so distressing that actually suicide is not that unusual. So, the idea of being tethered to that machine, while granted, it would keep me alive. Now, if my liver had failed and I didn't get a transplant, that would be it. So kidney dialysis does keep people alive for a while, but it just seemed like a really, really half a life. And so I knew I needed a kidney, but I didn't know exactly when I would need dialysis. So as I said, the clock's sort of ticking, and it turned out I had about a good year before my function got to the point where it really was physically, becoming physically debilitated. But it was very hard finding a donor, and that's what kind of galvanized me about this whole issue of the shortage. But just in terms of finding a donor, as I say, it was extremely difficult. It's not like every day you ask people for a body part. And I didn't have, I have a very tiny family, and to make a long story short, none of them were, I didn't feel I could ask any of them. And in fact, I never really asked anyone. I would do it all differently if, heaven forbid, there's yet a third time I have to go through this. But I'm very nice to my interns. But I would just talk about it with folks, and wasn't even being coy. I just sort of thought magically, some people will think about being a donor, and it'll work out. But became pretty clear that it wasn't working out. And a lot of people actually said they would do it. And I appreciate that, in that I know they wanted to be, I know they felt empathy for my situation. But, in the end, basically, a lot of them got cold feet and backed out. And then you're in this terribly awkward position because you really can't be angry. I mean, it's an enormous thing to ask, and incredibly presumptuous to have the expectation that they owe it to you or anything. And so I was really getting very demoralized and about to go, get ready to go on dialysis. And Virginia Postrel, who I knew not very well, had been at a cocktail reception somewhere. This was in November of 2005, and she ran into a mutual friend and asked that friend how I was. And the friend said, well, it's so hot. She needs a kidney. And Virginia went, I think the next day went to her computer and said, I remember the subject line. I still have a printout of her email. It said, serious offer. And then she said, so-and-so told me you needed a kidney, and if I'm a match, I will do it. And then I think she followed up a few minutes later with another email, I won't back out. And so obviously she went through with it. This was March of 2016, and
it wasn't March of
2006, yeah. And I'm almost as grateful to Steve, her husband, as to her, because that was one of the reasons that two of my other friends who had seriously considered donating, did not go through with it because their spouse basically said, it's the kidney or a divorce. So you kind of underestimate how important family buy-in is in something like this. But, God bless both of them. So she did it, and clearly I got a lot smarter. And Virginia did very well, and she wrote some, I think, very powerful articles about the importance of donating organs. And I suspect she influenced a few people. I know an article I wrote about the whole experience back in 2007. I for about 2 years afterwards, I got emails from people. This is the most gratifying thing that's ever happened to me in my life. People saying, I read your article, and I decided to donate to a stranger. So I feel my work is done, But anyway, so that had a happy ending. And then I took on, in addition to my various interests at AEI, I also took on the interest of how to expand the organ supply.
Virginia Postrel was a guest on EconTalk, and we talked about that. This is an incredible gift, kindness, amazing thing. And I want to talk about your second donor in a second, but first I want to stick with Virginia. How did that, and you're a psychiatrist, so you're somewhat, at least, if not very self-aware of the emotional component to this. How did that receiving of that organ affect you? You made a joke. You said, I got a lot smarter. I think that was an allusion to the fact that you had Virginia Postrel's kidney. But how did it affect you psychologically, and how do you think it affected her? And have you and her talked about it?
Oh, of course. You're certainly not the first person to ask me that, but I always find that a curious question. Some people have actually said, do you still see Virginia? It's like, oh my goodness. Yes, I see Virginia, and she's remains magnificent. As she wrote about it, and as she acted the entire time, we were planning to do this, because there is quite a bit of a workup medically and to some extent psychologically for the donor, which is done by the medical center, and rightly so. So she acted the whole time like, well, let's just get this thing over. And in fact, as she's written about it, she said her attitude, these are her words, I was very instrumental about it. I had something she needed, and I knew she had no one else to give it to her. And clearly it truly was a life and death, or at least a quality of life and death situation. And she did. And I mean, while on the one hand, of course, I'm just speechless with gratitude. And I would actually occasionally feel tearful in that first year and a few years afterwards when I think of what she did for me. But it was sort of the same. I kind of shared her sense and hoped that I would feel the same way if the tables were turned and someone I knew needed one. But, the sense of I didn't feel, of course I kid when I say my IQ went up. I could only wish. But people do talk about, they get kind of romanticize the whole process. I felt, and especially with hearts, as you can imagine, a heart transplant, but they actually feel like a sort of a piece of the person, almost spiritually, inside them, or they feel a little change in their personality. And both of us were sort of, I think, listen, we just exchanged organs, and or rather, she gave me one. And again, thank God. I wish I were wealthy. I would endow a wing wherever she wanted. But I just feel like she's, of course, a bond with her that I'm sure you don't feel with even your closest friend. It has a quality that's different and almost primitive in some way, but in a charming way.
So that kidney didn't work out completely. It should have lasted about 15 to 20 years. Living kidneys last about 15 to 20 years, and ones you get from deceased people, cadaver kidneys, about 10 to 12. So hers should have lasted longer, also because I wasn't on dialysis first, and that tends to also detract from the longevity of the kidney, of a deceased and living kidney, if you've already been on dialysis for quite a while. So I was an ideal candidate to have her kidney last, quite a while. But just make a long story short, I ended up getting pneumonia, possibly from the immunosuppression, because you have to be on immunosuppressive drugs forever so that your own immune system doesn't attack the new organ. And but anyway, so I got a fairly serious pneumonia, and so then it becomes very difficult, because in order to fight off the pneumonia, your immune system needs to be unleashed, but if it's unleashed, then it's also going to attack the kidney. So it's a very delicate balance, which I lost. Although, again, it was a gradual matter. It took about 3 years for Virginia's kidney to really, for all the mileage, basically, to run out. And so I knew about 2 years, even before it was probably going to fail completely, that I needed to start looking for another one. So that's rather incredible, but I just have to ask a medical question first. So your body, 8 or 9 years after getting this kidney, which looked something quite similar to your original kidney that you were born with, it's a kidney. It's not repurposed Lego toy or a repurposed liver. It's a kidney. And 8 or 10 years later, your body still is angry at it and would reject it if you were not on immunosuppressant drugs. That's so interesting to me. I didn't realize that.
Oh, yes, that's true of all organs and all transplants. And some organs are more, I think the word is immunogenic than others, which kidneys are, bone marrow is. Actually, livers are any organ will be rejected if there's no immunosuppression. But apparently people who have liver transplants need to take a smaller dose of immunosuppressants. For some reason, it's more resistant to rejection.
What's the rejection? What happens? What would have happened if you didn't take immunosuppressive drugs, say, with a few years after your...
Well, in 2 weeks, if you stop taking immunosuppressant drugs completely, then within 2 to 4 weeks, your organ just starts to fail, and so your complete metabolic milieu just goes out of balance, and if your kidney shuts down, obviously you don't. Yeah. Well, you don't. There's no way for fluid to leave your body. So at its worst, it would back up into your lungs and impede breathing. Although by the time it gets to that part, you're such a metabolic derangement, you're probably already somewhat delusional, or delirious, I should say. But yeah, it happens. People stop dialysis, for example, which is effectively the same thing. That's your external kidney,
right, sure.
You could argue, and within about 2 weeks. If you have zero kidney function, some people always have a little residual kidney function, but if you truly have none, few people will last more than about a month, and that's it's called uremic poisoning. Was the quaint term for it.
But you got a second kidney from was a stranger?
No. This is another earthbound saint. This woman is named Kim Hendrickson, and she was kind of a witness to all this trauma during before I met. Well, I knew Virginia slightly, but before Virginia agreed to do this for me back in 2005. And Kim was a research assistant for Michael Grieva. I'm sure many folks probably know. He's a constitutional lawyer who was at a scholar who was at AEI at the time. And she was his assistant and my friend. And she saw all this happening. And she thought, wow, if you need another one, I'm keeping mine warm. At the time, she couldn't do it because she was just got married, wanted to have children, and understandably, you wanted to have her kids first before she subjected herself to. It's a fairly small risk, but didn't want to complicate things for a future family. Understand completely. Also, at the time, she was. Well, she still is blood type B, and at the time, you had to have the same blood type as your donor. But again, the science of immunology has made such progress that now you can get a kidney from a donor who doesn't even have your blood type. And you do a little more preparation than last time. So I had to go in the hospital a few days earlier, and they what's called plasmapheresis, but basically they filter out some of your the cells that would otherwise attack the new organ at the right when it's introduced, and so they were able to do that, and her kidney is working fine, and she did it, and that time around, the stress level was next to zero, because what made the experience of the transplant so difficult was not the surgery. To tell you the truth, it's over, right? And I left the hospital in 5 days, 6 days, and I'm not that stoic, but actually all I needed was Tylenol. Not that it didn't hurt, but and then you recover. The scary parts are whether it's going to be rejected, in other words, whether your immune system will still overpower the efforts to suppress it, or whether you get an infection, because, again, you're immunosuppressed, and they really do industrial strength immunosuppression at the time of the surgery, and that makes you very prone to infection. You're it's not supposed to go on a train or in crowded places or a plane for about 6 months. And I actually did get an infection, and I had to go back, but only for 4 days, and the antibiotics were incredibly effective, and then I came home, and that was that. So the difficult part for me was finding that donor, and Kim took that anxiety, just completely removed it. So
let's talk about the policy. Let's talk about the policy implications or policy environment, which, to review for people who've, like myself, have forgotten from our past episodes on this, which I'll put a link up to. But so let's say you were talking to me when you needed that second kidney, and I'd said, Sally, you're a nice person, but this is just a real hardship for me. But I'd do it for $10,000. Now, that's an illegal transaction, right? I cannot sell you my kidney. I can donate a kidney to a stranger. Mm-hmm. Can I donate? And evidently, I can donate a kidney to a particular stranger, right? So there's a waiting list right now that's frighteningly long of people on dialysis who'd like a kidney. They get one when someone just donates to the list. But Kim didn't donate to the list. She donated to you. Explain how that worked.
Sure. So among living donation, and then we'll get to deceased donation, but among living donation, which accounted for I have the numbers here somewhere, but accounted for a little under, there were 18,000 kidney transplants last year, and about 5,600 of them came from living people. The remainder came obviously from deceased, but not 1,800 minus 5,600, because you can get more than one kidney.
18,000 because you get two from it, yeah.
Yeah. But in any case, so a living donor either comes from a friend or a relative, and that's the typical scenario. There are some amazing souls called Good Samaritan donors who just listen to EconTalk and think, wow, the shortage is just terrible. 12 people every day die because nobody was able to give them a kidney, or they could not survive the list, which now has 98,000 people on it. So someone listens to this, goes to GW and says, I just want to be an anonymous kidney donor. So that's called non-directed donation. When someone gives to someone they know, a friend or a relative, that's directed. Another form of directed could be, and I don't imagine this happens very much, is if I heard that your uncle needed a kidney and I really just didn't want to deal with it. I just wanted to give him the kidney and not really, I could give it, literally go to the hospital and say, please give my kidney to Russ's uncle. But I think that's more common in the deceased scenario, where your neighbor is on dialysis and heaven forbid your kid is in a terrible accident and ultimately dies. And you could say, please give my son's kidney to Russ's uncle, And so that would be a directed deceased. But most deceased kidneys, which come from people who are mainly brain dead, although there are some other mechanisms, but it's mainly brain dead individuals, those kidneys, go to the next person on the list. It pretty much is a first come, first serve as far as the kidney queue is concerned.
98,000 people are on the list.
It went down.
And 18,000 are available. So that means there's 80,000 disappointed people who are going to have to wait till next year. And some of them, of course, don't make it. They die. Right. The first question, I'm sure someone's asked you this, and it's not a comfortable question, but I think it comes to mind. It's not my way of looking at the world, but there are people who look at the world this way. They would say, you had no right to two kidneys when there were 98,000 people on that list. You should have donated Kim's kidney. You should have asked Kim to give to the next person on that waiting list. What's your response to that?
If somebody said that to me, I would ask them why they
Sally,
don't offer.
I'm really glad you're here, right? I've not.
Thanks.
I don't know your work as well as I could or should, but I'm glad you're alive. But it's an interesting question of when there's a shortage like this of who should get this precious thing.
Right. Well, there are two answers to that. I would truly ask the person who asked me that question, why don't they consider donating? My other question to them was, would you please join our effort to change the law, the ban against rewarding people who would like to save someone's life? Let's be able to do that.
I mean, my view is Kim's allowed to give her kidney to whoever she wants, and if it happens to be you, that's her choice. So I have no problem with it, but I'm sure there are many people who don't think she should have that choice and who would resent or judge. That's the system for that aspect of it.
If they did, though, the reality, as you say, the reality is Kim would say, well, tough. Now I'm keeping it. So
right.
No one
would. The other question I had, and I don't know if you know about this, so you can certainly say you don't know, but my understanding is that if you're a person of means and you don't want to wait on that list, you can go to certain countries in the world. We talked about, I think it's Iran. Is it Iran that has
Iran? But you couldn't go there. But
right.
Yes,
that's a separate issue. But a person could, or they could maybe go somewhere else where an Iranian kidney could be transferred to you, and some other, maybe Turkey, who knows where. But I would think that given how valuable this is, you'd think it'd be difficult to keep people from stopping people from making the transaction. I guess the barrier is the medical system, because if I say to you, well, I don't know why, but let's say it this way. You come to me, you say, I'm at the cocktail party, I hear you need a kidney. And I say to you, Sally, I'd really love to give you a kidney, but it seems to me that it's a big pain in, I was going to say in the neck, but it's a pain in the side for me, and I don't want to give it up. But, if you made it worth my while, I think we could work something out. And so I, quote, direct my kidney to you, but then you buy me a Ferrari 6 months afterwards. Is anybody keeping an eye on that? I mean, I hope they're not, but
nah.
No,
I don't think they are. And I'm sure this kind of thing goes on, and I would be happy to engage in that myself. If that happened and it was someone I could trust, because you really do. I mean, it's uncomfortable. Let me back up. I didn't talk about matchingdonors.com, which is a website, kind of like a JDate thing, except it's KDate. You're looking for someone to give you a kidney, and it's totally legal. You could go on it right now, matchingdonors.com. And it is, again, no money is exchanged, and there's a big, warning sign that it's illegal to exchange any money. But that's a mechanism that I did try at first before the guy backed out, and that's when Virginia came along. But that's relevant to what you just asked me, because there are people on that website who are looking for green cards. I mean, they are looking for something in exchange. And I've also gotten a lot of letters from people who say, I wish this was during the recession. I got so many letters from people saying, I wish I could sell my kidney and get out of foreclosure, or get one woman had NICU bills to pay, another man lost his business, and every one of those letters, every person said, and I would be saving someone. So I grant you, even if they didn't have that, even if there wasn't that kind of humane dimension to it, I still think it would be legitimate for people to be able to be rewarded for saving someone's life. But the fact is that both the financial and the humanitarian dimensions, intermingled with all the people who wrote to me. It was really kind of moving, and you wish they could have been able to do that.
Yeah, I often emphasize, I think it's a really important point, that money certainly motivates people. It's not the only thing that motivates people. There are many, many, many intrinsic rewards that we receive, or punishments that we receive for the things we do. And financial incentives are both positive and negative, are not the only things that motivate us. They can motivate us, though, and they can certainly coexist with those other motives. So certainly if I sold you a kidney for $25,000 or a new car, whatever it was, I hope I'd still enjoy also, in addition to that, the satisfaction I'd get from knowing that a person whose health was impaired was now healthy and had a better chance of living a good and healthy life. So I think it's a really important point. And so I have, in theory, we'll get to this maybe in a little bit, but I have in theory no problem with a market for kidneys where people buy and sell, that I assume they would also get the satisfaction from helping people, not just the money. I don't see any reason why those things are exclusive. And I think it's a terrible mistake to think that they are. But now let's move to your proposal. You have suggested in this article that the federal government incentivize kidney donors with a tax credit. So explain how that might work.
The tax credit would just be one option, and I'll locate it in a larger context, and then I can tell you what our plan was. But the general idea, and I think people have been talking about this since I once found a paper in 1968. The first kidney transplant was in 1953, and soon, within a decade, people already realized that there was going to be a shortage, even though we officially didn't set up the list until 1984 in this country. But the idea is, think about, I guess, first, what you don't want to happen. You don't want someone to rush into this kind of thing and then regret it. Now, maybe you're going to say, well, that happens all the time in human, transactions, and that's probably true. But in this case, if you were to design an ideal system, this is a transaction, kind of unlike other things. There are some analogies, and we can talk about that, but it's a momentous kind of engagement for a person to donate. So you want to make sure they're not rushing into something that they regret. And so this is why a free market, a classic free market, is not something that's ever seriously been considered in terms of proposals. So the general idea is that there is a third party, and it could be the government, it could be a government-appointed charity, or even this could be at the state level, that is the provider of the benefit. And the benefit is not immediate cash because, again, you want to prevent a scenario where a desperately poor person is rushing to do this and then going to regret it. So you don't offer what desperately poor people want, which is immediate cash. So the kinds of rewards that people have talked about are, well, tax credits or a contribution to someone's 401k, loan forgiveness, or they could, for example, forward the benefit to a charity of their choice. But you get the idea. And as I said, a third party would administer this. And there'd probably be a waiting period built in of about six months to a year, again, for a cooling off kind of aspect to it. And the funding for this could come from dialysis, which is payments for dialysis from Medicare, which is the largest payer of dialysis, are 7% of the entire Medicare budget. So it's about $90,000 a year for each person. So that could easily underwrite the value of the benefit, which most people have pegged around $50,000, but it's just really almost an intuitive amount. So the tax credit, if that were the route that was taken, but it would be a refundable tax credit, so people who didn't pay taxes at all would be able to benefit, and they would get $5,000 a year, either as a refunded benefit or off your taxes if you paid taxes. But that wouldn't kick in. I mean, we're really we put in a lot of protections, and it's quite paternalistic. But it wouldn't kick in for a year, and then it would again be $5,000 a year, and then if it were refundable, it'd be $5,000 a year for 10 years. And if it were, if the person were paying taxes, I think we said they could have the $25,000 after 5 years. But the idea is to, again, dampen the magnitude of the incentive. And I can tell you why we're twisting ourselves in a pretzel to do this kind of thing. Well, the answer very quickly is because of the intense opposition to this idea that has been mounted by much of the transplant community, although to the credit of the transplant surgeons, they are more receptive to it and have become more receptive to it over the years.
I think they would be. They have a financial incentive. I'm going to interrupt because I find it utterly fascinating. Obviously, there's a pragmatic aspect to what you're proposing, which I respect. I have no problem with it. Don't agree with the outlines of it, though, and I just want to make the case against it, and then you can either just say, well, it's pragmatic, or you can disagree with me, whatever you want. It's remarkable to me. First of all, of course, the doctor, the surgeon, is not expected to do this life-saving surgery, life-transforming surgery as a charitable act. No one says to the surgeon, we'll give you a $50,000 tax credit for every one of these you do, or a $5,000, whatever it is. I don't want you to get paid for it, of course, because that would be immoral. And it might make you think that the human body is like, a slag mine, some kind of coal mine. So we're not going to pay you directly, and we're not going to pay you right away because I want you to do it for the good of the patient. So obviously the surgeon has somehow managed to live a decent life and survive by being paid directly a full semi-market. It's not a market amount, of course, but because it's all messed up. But they get cash. They get what's called cash. And yet you're going to make a poor person who wants to transform the life of their child, for example, wait 5 years to get their money. You're going to make them wait. Make them wait.
Year, but yeah.
No, but to get not to get. They're only going to get $5,000 the first year.
Oh, okay, all of it. Yeah.
Yeah, to get all of it, it's going to be over a few years. And then the idea that they might want to help their kid now. Too bad. We're going to make you wait 6 months so you can be sure you're not going to regret it. I find it interesting that. Of course, I'm a messed up person. I'm an economist, but I find it interesting that anyone would object to this. So the people, I'm fascinated.
Welcome to my world.
What? Welcome to your world. Who would? I think there are different ways to think about it. If you did a survey of people and said, "Are you in favor of letting people buy and sell their kidneys?" I think the number would be 98 to 2% to 2% against. But if you said, if a poor person's really desperate and they can save someone's life, should they be allowed to save their kidney and thereby get their child a college education? I think the number would be very different than 98 to 2. And I'm curious how politically you think that works out. Why is it? Is there a better way to say it? Is there a vested interest here that I'm not thinking about yet? I'm going to work on it. But who would be harmed by this? I mean, the people who run the list, they're very important now, and they get a lot of attention, and they have a purpose in life that might be hurt by the fact that this market would work better if we had these incentives, even though they're roundabout. Who's against this?
Well, I'll start with the National Kidney Foundation. They have been the most vociferous opponent, and they actually did actively try to sabotage. I know I'm not supposed to talk about specific legislation, but efforts years ago that were made to try to rethink the National Organ Transplant Act, which is the legislation that forbids any kind of exchange. But
why are they against it? Why would the National Kidney Foundation, which is supposedly in favor of people being helped who are struggling with kidney issues, why wouldn't they be thrilled that say, I don't know, 75,000 more people would get kidneys than now?
Well, I'm baffled as well, but I can tell you what they say.
Yeah, what do they say?
Well, they say a few things. They start using the language of commodification. In other words, you're treating people like spare fenders in a junkyard. They are afraid you are it will taint the process, I've heard. It will devalue human life. It will, and then they say something that's actually something one could measure because it's an empirical matter, that it will crowd out altruistic giving, and worse, that it will just crowd out giving in general. But that's testable.
That's possible, right?
Yeah,
right?
I've actually looked at. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's possible that if you don't, and this argument's made for blood donation as well, if you're not going to get the moral satisfaction of helping someone, and now it becomes something you can just buy and sell, you won't donate because it's tawdry, which just means that, as an economist, just means you better set the price a little higher than you thought you might have needed to you might lose 5,000 people who donate right now willingly out of an incredible human kindness. And so now you're going to get as many people as you want to donate out of mercenary motives. And
exactly.
Exactly.
It's hard for me. I see your point exactly.
I know you do.
to the extent that anyone would be, I think, dissuaded, I would, as a psychiatrist, say, well, are we talking about altruism or narcissism? What was really motivating you? Was social signaling motivating you? But in any case, maybe it was, and we know that is powerful for some people. But, okay, then I'm sorry you won't be able to save someone. But here are 10 other people in line who would love to do it. So that gets into the question of motivation, which is also held very dearly by the National Kidney Foundation and other opponents, which is that it has to be done for the right reasons. But this is what we hear from the National Kidney Foundation, what you hear from some particularly vocal transplant surgeons and nephrologists. Although, as I said, as a group, the transplant surgeons they did a poll of their organization in 2009, and the vast majority, 75%, were in favor of at least testing this idea. So I do give them credit. But I have to tell you, I've looked at all the polls that have been done on this, and the public is much more open-minded than the experts. And then we bring in the bioethicists.
Well, that's because the public, there are many of us who have relatives who have kidney problems. Yeah. We want to help them. I just have to go back to the National Kidney Foundation for a second. I don't know anyone in the National Kidney Foundation. I know nothing about the NKF or whatever it's called, but it's not like it's not like AARP, the American Association for Retired People, which has millions of members. The National Kidney Foundation is a nonprofit, I assume. Its headquarters, I assume, are in Washington, D.C. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think they are. Yeah.
And they have some number of people in that building in Washington, D.C., maybe 100. I doubt they have 1,000. What's it mean to say they're against it? Why do they matter? And politically, why does anyone care what the National Kidney Foundation thinks?
Yeah, they matter a lot to my deep chagrin because they are the first organization that congressional offices think of. They always say, well, what does the NKF think? It's kind of like a cancer issue. You know, what does the NCI? What does the American Cancer Society think? They have disproportionate influence, and they have a PAC as well. But it is unfortunate.
Who would donate money to that PAC?
Oh, anyone who's see people who've gotten deceased kidneys, and people who they actually have.
I get it. It's okay. I get it. Okay. Obviously, there's some sense of gratitude there because they're the coordinators of the list and they make a donation or whatever. But I'm not giving them another penny until they change their view on monetary incentives, and I don't give them a penny now, so it's not much of a threat. But it's a fascinating issue. Let's take one of their arguments more seriously. I mean, we're picking on them, and it's not, of course, just them. They're not alone. It's not like they're the only people against this. A lot of people are troubled or uneasy about monetary incentives, and I understand that. Let's take the commodification idea seriously. Is there something immoral, or we have taboos about it, but if we think about it rationally a little bit, is there something immoral about sharing a body part for money? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. What I think is fascinating. I mean, the reason I bring up the surgeon thing, it wasn't my idea. I forget who wrote about it first, where I read it. But it's fascinating that that's not commodification, that the surgeon's hands are used to make money to rip out somebody's kidney and shove it into somebody else's body. We don't consider that person somehow morally troubled. And yet somehow, and they make money, real cash, and yet somehow if we are to do it who don't have their, high priest status, I don't know what's the – I'm in a ornery mood hearing your plight. It's just interesting that this idea – commodification is an interesting word, right?
Yeah,
it sounds awful. I don't know really what it means when I push it.
Well, it's one of the three words that are used to, frankly I don't want to sound melodramatic, but silence folks like me. And I'm not the only one. Heaven knows. Richard Epstein, a lot of us, Virginia, have been vocal about, changing the law. But commodification, exploitation, and coercion are the Holy Trinity that's supposed to end the discussion. But you're exactly right. The one person who takes the risk and gives the thing a value gets nothing. Commodification, from what I can it becomes pretty clear when you listen to people who brandish that word in a menacing way. What they really are concerned about is having respect for the donor and treating him or her well. And of course, that is essential. It's the basis of any kind of ethically sound system. In fact, I would say there are at least four elements. One is respect for the person's capacity to make a decision about something that might be in his own best interest. Then, of course, informed consent. These are all the things that are not, of course, in a black market, yet folks who have debated me and others say, well, if we do this here, we'll have a black market. And you want to say, what? We have a black market. Frankly, we have a thriving global black market in organs because we don't have a transparent system. But anyway, respect for the person's autonomy, informed consent, protecting their health, which of course doesn't happen in a black market at all. And in fact, even in our current system, if you don't have health insurance and you have a complication a few months after you've donated, granted, probably most hospitals will help you out, but they don't have to. In fact, in our plan, there would be health insurance for at least 2 years so that if there were complications, the person would be guaranteed to be taken care of. Anyway,
you know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of when, I think if you're in the Baseball Hall of Fame, you get a lifetime pass to any park in America. It kind of should be, this is not a serious comment, but there's something emotionally satisfying about the idea that if you've crossed into a hospital to voluntarily help save a life with one of your organs, you should be able to walk into a hospital for the rest of your life and say, I need this, give it to me. And they should just say,
the gift shop, right?
Yeah, you're one of those, you're in. Yeah. It's all taken care of. It's free. Here's your free pass. But that's a little extreme.
Well, I was just going through my internal list of the conditions that need to be satisfied to allay the fact that someone is not being respected. So you reward them amply. Obviously, if you gave them $1, now that would be exploitation, but you reward them in a generous way. Gratitude is expressed, and that's really all that needs to happen. And none of it happens in a black market, of course, but can easily happen here. And it happens already, except there's no money attached to it. But in this case, there would be a reward for people who would like, again, to benefit while they save someone's life.
You spoke loosely a minute ago. You said the one person doesn't get anything out of it as the donor. But, of course, the donor does get the emotional satisfaction, which is enormous. I know you meant that. I just was a figure of speech. But it's an interesting question. I'm now going to take the critics of our perspective a little more seriously. Interesting question. Let's suppose, just hypothetically, that the market price, whether we're a literal market, which I understand, I agree, is unlikely. No one proposed it seriously other than maybe me and 3 other people. But let's say we went to some system where we allowed this sort of arm's length third-party compensation via the tax system or something else that you'd like to encourage. And let's say that number got to be $1 million. Okay, that's what it took. And someone, maybe a foundation, steps forward and says, I don't just want to save the 98,000 people on the list. I want to save the X 100,000, 500,000, whatever it is, who are at risk. And rather than wait till they go on dialysis, they should just get a new kidney. And I'm going to pick a large enough number that compensating them that the donors that they'll will step forward. And that turns out to be worth $1 million. Now, I'm going to say something really tacky here, which is, but it's mildly amusing for EconTalk listeners. Somebody who's been listening to EconTalk since 2010 has heard about Bitcoin. And I have a friend who mocks me because I knew about Bitcoin in 2010 and missed the boat. Of course, he wasn't an EconTalk listener then, so he missed the boat too. So it's kind of a mutual make fun of each other thing. But it'd be an interesting thing to think about. You have 2 people in your life who did something unbelievably generous. What this system that you're encouraging would do would put a monetary value in some dimension on their kindness. And then also, in a way, it would suggest what they gave up to give you a kidney. That it's one thing to say, well, they risked their life, which they did. It's another thing to say that they went through surgery, which is painful and scary, which they did. They also had recovery that they endured, which they did. And now you're telling them, and by the way, you could have made $1 million. You gave away that precious thing. Now, my view on that is that makes it even sweeter to them that they did something. In a way, it enhances their generosity. But perhaps some people would say it creates bitterness. It takes the emotion out of it. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Russ, I'm sorry, but I actually think I missed the offer that people would. Do you say they'd be offered $1 million if they'd give a kidney to get?
No, I'm saying suppose after the system that you and I you and I would like a different system than the current system, which relies only on altruism.
Right.
And let's suppose that either because there's a free market in kidneys or because some kind of encouragement step comes forward in the form of a tax credit or payment of a house note or whatever it is by a third party, whether it's the government through the tax system or a foundation. And it turns out that price gets set not at $50,000 but at $1 million.
Oh, okay. So I thought
so that tells Virginia and Kim, your two angels, that they did something, that they gave up an enormous sum of money and gave you something. Does it change their feeling about it? Would it change the level of gratitude you feel? Was it – it adds something to it. We have to be fair to the, quote, commodification people. It puts a price tag on something that right now is unpriced.
Well, I guess we have to realize that, I mean, there are things – I guess we have some models for it where, there may be a law passed that now you could take a huge tax credit for something that you couldn't have before, and then there's some regret. So I think there's always regret built into any kind of transaction when conditions can change. But I'll tell you, there's just so much latitude you have, and now I have to be relentlessly practical on this issue, which is the MDs are always the intermediary. I mean, and they won't do – right now we can't even, frankly, make enough headway to get them to even, as a group, seriously consider this, to even study this, to be honest. But, but let's say the price went up to $1 million. They would talk about – this is where they would talk about undue inducement. In other words, an offer that's too good to refuse. And I'm telling you, an IRB would never get this thing, would never go.
Explain. What's an IRB?
Oh, Institutional Review Board. Yeah. I mean, it would be considered just unethical, and they would never do it.
You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of Nick Saban. Nick Saban's the coach of the Alabama football team. He is part of a cartel called the National Collegiate Athletic Association that makes it illegal to pay athletes who perform at the University of Alabama anything other than tuition. The market value of those athletes, a handful of them, is tens, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars for the amount of money that they generate for the University of Alabama and other similar football programs. And it is considered demeaning to them that they would be paid for their toil in the trenches of the football stadium. But somehow Nick Saban can make millions of dollars a year, and he will tell you with a straight face, and I've heard other coaches – I've never heard Nick say this, but I've heard other coaches say with a straight face, it wouldn't be good for the educational aspects of football and the university system for those athletes to be paid. But somehow it's okay for the coaches to make millions of dollars off the free labor of these people. So these surgeons and doctors who you're defending right now, they make hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of dollars transplanting kidneys, that the few that are available, and would be offended if somehow people made as much money as they did. Doesn't sound so good.
Oh, actually, well, for what it's worth, they're actually not they don't begrudge. I think any of these people making money, I'm sure if their stocks, split 7 times, they'd be thrilled for their patients. But yeah, a lot of them, you're right, do find this troubling. But I have to shout out to all the surgeons I have been working with over the years, and all the ones that have come around to at least testing this. But unfortunately, their organization, the American Society of Transplant Surgeons, will not officially make a statement that we should study this. But, one thing that comes up, and if you don't want to go in this direction, we don't have to, but is the language that's used in these debates, and I frankly almost put debates in quotes because some of the moral reasoning is so shoddy. But, as I said before, though, you hear words like exploit. You hear words that no one ever defines. Like commodification is one of them. And arguably the doctor's right who do the surgery have commodified their service. And the procurement service, which is they're performed by OPOs, organ procurement organizations, that are paid by, I believe, Medicare or Medicaid, or they're paid from the federal government. It could be through the United Network for Organ Sharing. But in any case, it's $50,000 to take an organ and transfer it, from a deceased person in an emergency room to an operating room, somewhere else. So, yeah, there's a lot of money floating around. But exploitation, for example, is a word you will hear. And that makes sense in the black market, where these poor folks are offered a pittance. Now, granted, even in their world, $2,000 could mean a hell of a lot, but they don't get that $2,000. It's rare that they get what they're promised. There's no contract, so of course they can't go on. They're not informed consent. Those people are exploited. Then you hear about coercion, and that is a word. In fact, Alan Wertheimer, who was a wonderful philosopher, I believe, political philosopher. Unfortunately, he passed away recently, but he actually did a survey of bioethicists and asked them about the definitions of words like coercion, exploitation, and actually most of them got coercion wrong. It can means two things. Basically, I kidnap you. In the most physical sense, I have imposed my physical will on you. I'm not going to let you leave my house. I kidnapped you, whatever. You strong-arm someone in the most literal sense. Or you present a choice, and where either option leaves you worse off, like your money or your life. Yeah. If I am given the opportunity to sell my kidney, that's not coercion, because if I don't do it, I'm not any worse off. Yet, that's a word they frequently use. And what they really mean is undue inducement as opposed to inducement. Inducement is when we're walking down the street and we see a big ad in Saks that says 50% off. And, it's something you wouldn't have done ordinarily. You wouldn't have shopped in Saks ordinarily. Well, maybe you would, but sadly I don't. But if there's a good sale, I'll really think about it. I'll do something I might not have otherwise done. But that's just an inducement. It becomes an undue inducement, and this is where the too good to refuse dimension comes in, when the temptation is so strong that it actually interferes with my capacity to rationally weigh the costs and benefits.
Yeah, of course, that's very hard to measure. We had an episode with Mike Munger on what he calls voluntary exchange, which relates to some of these issues. I encourage people to listen to that. We're almost out of time. You have a very brief speculation in your paper about the future of organ transplants. There's some encouraging news on the horizon. Talk about that, even if none of these changes that you and I think I are in favor of even if they don't happen.
Yeah, I think, when you have your EconTalk in 25 to 30 years with, some genius materials scientist, he can tell you all about the synthetic organs. I think there's no question that your grandkids are going to think it was primitive that we had to take organs from actual people. We'll probably either be printing organs, which means that you would have a cartilaginous infrastructure or skeleton of any of the organs. And the heart is the most easy to envision. Actually, if you take the cells, you can wash the cells. Obviously, it's a complicated process, but you can actually take the cells off a heart, and then you're left with kind of a skeleton underneath. It's not bone, it's cartilage. And then you could use the patient's own stem cells to seed it. And cells know where to go. They're quite brilliant. We already do that with hollow organs like bladders and tracheas, but we'll get to the point. I have no question we'll be able to do it for the more complex organs, hearts, livers. Kidneys may be one of the toughest. Their architecture is very complicated. Or what's called transgenic pigs, where their kidney is, or their immune systems are manipulated in such a way that the kidney of that pig could be transplanted into a person and not rejected, or not even transmit really the hardest puzzle has been to protect against transmitted viruses that are endemic to certain animal species. Maybe microdialysis machines. Right now a dialysis machine looks like a washing machine, but there's no reason, and they already have smaller versions of them, but I'm sure they'll be able to through technology. I could imagine an implantable kidney that works like a dialysis machine, as opposed to being an organ replica. So I have no question that this problem will be solved in the next few decades, but it's a lot of death until then. It's about 7,000 to 8,000 people a year who die because they couldn't survive the wait for any organ.
My guest today has been Sally Satel. Sally, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Oh, thank you for having me.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.